I have a story to tell you this evening, and it is not an easy one to hear. There will be discussion of massacre, sexual violence, famine, child loss, and if at any point you feel you need to step out, please do feel at liberty to do so. It is also a story of joy, kindness, love, and community, and it's really at the intersection of these two extremes that our story takes place. And although I am calling it a story here for the narrative format of this lecture, I do ask that you remember that this is the lived experience of the brave participants of this study, some of whom are with us tonight. I have changed the names for anonymity purposes, and the pictures that you see are sometimes more of a representation to protect identity, but their experiences are nonetheless real. I get the honour of being the narrator this evening, but I am really just the medium. My voice is not the important one here, and wherever possible, I'll be using their words to most respectfully and authentically transport you through the different chapters of our journey this evening. But before we get started, I'd like to ask you to take a moment and picture something with me. Picture in your minds, who fights a war? Who fights a war? What do they look like? Where do they go? What do they wear? What do they do? Who are they? I'd like for you to keep that image in your mind, and we'll revisit it together at the end of this lecture. But for now, I invite you to come with me to the opening setting of our story this evening, which is Tigray, the most northern region of Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia is the only country on the continent never colonized. It's made up of 9 regional states, each with their own language, culture, and regional government. Home to 6 million people, Tigray borders Sudan to the west and Eritrea to the north, with whom it shares a majority language of Tigrinya. With its rugged mountainous terrain and its famous remote rock-cut churches, it's often seen as the cradle of Ethiopian civilization. Its historic significance is found not least in the myth of the Queen of Sheba, who allegedly lived in a stone palace in Axum, now a World Heritage Site, and thought to house the Ark of the Covenant. This place is actually among the many sites of cultural heritage that has been damaged and looted during the Tigray War, but more on that in a moment. Modern Ethiopia is sometimes called Abyssinia, although I will say largely by Europeans and not by residents themselves, which you can see there on the map at the bottom of the screen. It originally included Eritrea, which broke away from the country in the early 1990s. And contrary to the myth of 3,000 years of uninterrupted Ethiopian history, there was actually no unified government in the Ethiopian Empire until the 19th century. Perhaps the most recognizable and defining figure of modern Ethiopian history is the man on the screen there, Emperor Haile Selassie, who ruled from 1930, briefly interrupted by the Italian occupation of World War II, up until the beginning of our story tonight. Let's go back nearly 50 years to 1974. A military junta known as the Derg is in power in Ethiopia, and it's deposed Haile Selassie, and it's backed by the Soviet regime. Theirs is a repressive, violent administration based on ethnic hierarchies and a climate of fear. A small student group is born in Tigray, known as the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. They begin a movement to resist the regime of Red Terror under the Derg, and they seek the right for regional self-determination and autonomy. Over the next 17 years, the TPLF grows from this small, ideologically motivated student group to a highly organized military insurgency. They unite other revolutionary groups in Ethiopia, and they topple the Derg in 1991. The TPLF is at this time roughly 1/3 female. In fact, a core directive of TPLF military policy is that women are able to take up arms and participate in battle on an equal footing to their male peers. Beyond the role of soldier, women are considered combatants if they dedicate themselves to the war effort in other areas. They're trained as technicians, drivers, hospital workers, and political actors at a community and regional level. Now, this was relatively novel in late 20th century Ethiopia, where women were not typically permitted into spheres of activity perceived as masculine, like violence and politics. But I must tell you, it was not novel. It was not new in the broader history of gender and war. In fact, in every war, since the dawn of time, women have been active, present, conscious participants. Sometimes they have been soldiers, sometimes they have been spies, hospital workers, messengers, logistics managers, resistance movements, scientists, pilots. I could go on. They've been responsible for nationalism, morale, ideas, and strategy. Yet they are missing from so many histories of war. Their roles are dismissed or they're dimmed in the retelling of that conflict. And we paint war as a predominantly masculine phenomenon, and women who interact voluntarily in spheres of violence are recast as wives, followers, rather than the active, deliberate, engaged participants that they are. And this happens because of the prevailing idea that femininity is somehow incompatible with war and with violence, sometimes even presented as unnatural for women to engage in such arenas because of what we might call their maternalist position. In other words, their capacity as mothers, both in the physical reproductive sense and also in the idea that women take on responsibility as mothers of the nation in the figurative sense, suggests that they are somehow predisposed to peace and non-violent action. The image of the loving mother is placed across the moral continuum of an aggressive soldier. In our imagination, at least, they're left out of our vision of who does what during war. When I watch a war film or a TV series, I like to play a little game with myself called love interest or mother. These are seemingly the only two roles available for women in war, at least in the great minds of Hollywood. But historically, this is far from the case. And I'm not just talking about wars which we might deem to be righteous or just, but also in cases where women have been perpetrators of heinous violent crimes. In Rwanda, it was a woman who was in charge with inciting genocidal rape, the former Minister for Family Welfare, and the advancement of women, if you can believe it. The Rwandan War is also the first time rape was officially prosecuted as genocide in an international criminal tribunal. In former Yugoslavia, it was the former president of the Republika Srpska who was indicted on 2 counts of genocide and 5 counts of crimes against humanity. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, women are incriminated in 41.1% of female rape cases in conflict and 10% of male cases. This data radically contradicts the prevailing assumptions we have about the capacity of women to be violent and to knowingly, willingly engage in violent spaces. And it is in part why they're left out of post-war narratives, particularly, I will say, in Africa, where scholars in the global north have a propensity to write of African women as passive, disempowered victims, rather than acknowledging their consciousness, initiative, and agency. But it is yet more complicated than this. For women who do take on active fighting roles in war, their participation has enduring social consequences. Women who are known to have been particularly involved in conflict are often marginalized. They're set at the social fringes of what is acceptable female behavior in peace. They're no longer required as soldiers, and instead controlling their political, social, economic, reproductive activities become central to the peacebuilding process. In this context, efforts to restore social cohesion and the expectations of a peaceful, secure, orderly nation rely on the return of recognizable gender normativity, or in other words, familiar gender hierarchies and familiar gender roles. A study by Elise Barth in Eritrea found a few years after the war had ended that combatant women were either single or they were married to combatant men they had known in the war. Meanwhile, combatant men were largely married to civilian women. This is not as extensively documented in Ethiopia, but it is more than likely a similar case, as combatant women have noted their male comrades celebrated and respected their military performances, but when choosing a life partner, they seem to revere the domestic femininity of civilian women. At the end of the civil war in Sierra Leone, some of the women at the forefront of the rebel movement were later accused of being bewitched, depraved, insane. Others were excluded from female spaces because they were mambores, women who lived as men. Even more were relabeled wives, camp servants, despite their participation in battle. In the nationwide program of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, only 7.2% of women formally demobilized, despite comprising around 30 to 40% of the rebel forces. This chasm, this enormous disparity, was based on a problem that's common, historically, to other aid and peacebuilding operations. It's founded on the premise that women are a unit of victims in conflict, in need of protection and relief in war zones, but not directly participants themselves. In this UN-directed demilitarization program, to be considered a combatant, and therefore eligible for reinsertion benefits and psychosocial support, women were required to hand over a weapon or be registered with their commander. And this excluded female members of the rebel force in a number of ways, not least through the fact that many women were actually forced to share weapons between them, particularly when they held additional responsibilities for cooking, cleaning, and camp support alongside intermittent fighting. There's also evidence that some women chose to sell on their weapon to civilian men who wanted to reap the benefits of this reintegration program. They feared being associated with the UN scheme would ostracize them from their communities forever. Instead, they sought to hide or diminish their activities in war so as not to exclude themselves from the standards of peacetime feminine behavior. And this is in part why we have such a silence of women's testimonies in war. To speak about their conflict experiences means they might risk social marginalization, disrupt the delicate balance of accepted feminine performativity in peacetime communities. And thus, the cycle of the invisibilization of women fighters continues. Let's return to Tigray. Since 1991, the TPLF held a coalition government, a multi-ethnic federation in Ethiopia, which allowed a large degree of autonomy for local governments in the different regions of the country. In 2018, this coalition was voted out of power in favour of a new party led by this man, Abiy Ahmed Ali. Ahmed rode a wave of reformist movement in Ethiopia, calling for a new system to tackle unemployment, resource distribution and corruption. He even mended a fierce feud with neighbouring Eritrea to the north of Tigray, for which he was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 2018. But in November 2020, which was only 2 months after I began my PhD here at Reading, this Nobel Peace Prize winner carefully orchestrated an attack on the region of Tigray, with, we now know, the intimate collaboration of Isaias Afwerki and the Eritrean government to the north. He also endorsed the participation of local militia from the neighbouring region of Amhara, which you can see there on the screen in yellow. For months leading up to this attack, Ahmed had been showing his true colours as anti-Tigrayan, removing Tigrayans from within his government, arresting key politicians, and endorsing a dangerous rhetoric of hate and ethnic division at the highest level. TPLF elites had held some of the most important political offices between 1991 and 2018, where Ahmed came to power, allegedly claiming a disproportionate amount of resources for Tigray's minority, although this is disputed. Ahmed was able to capitalise on the smouldering resentment for the TPLF to unite historically opposing political groups in Ethiopia against a common enemy. In the summer of 2020, the TPLF protested the fact that Ahmed had postponed the national election, and they held their own regional vote in which they won 90% of the seats. In retaliation, Ahmed readied the attack we now know was months in the planning. He excused his actions to the international community as a law and order operation against the TPLF, but it didn't take him long to classify the TPLF as anyone of Tigrayan ethnicity, regardless of their political participation. In the past 18 months, the 6 million people of Tigray have been living under a bitterly fought civil war. Tigray has been blockaded, cut off from communication, phone, internet, most electricity for well over a year. On this day, at this moment, 500,000 Tigrayans are facing famine, 60,000 are living as refugees in Sudan, and more than 30,000 women have been subjected to weaponized sexual violence and rape by the government and Eritrean troops and Amhara militia. And while there's been a strong armed response from the Tigray Defence Force, it is no exaggeration to say the federal government intends to use the threat to civilians in the form of starvation, indiscriminate brutal massacres, and sexual violence to force the TPLF into submission. It's also no exaggeration to say that the conditions in Tigray at this moment is the greatest humanitarian crisis of this century. I know all eyes are on Ukraine, but the silence around this other catastrophic war in the world is deafening. I won't go into why there's such a disparity in reporting, other than to put it into perspective by saying that in Tigray, 500,000 are estimated to have been killed since November 2020, including 100,000 in fighting, 200,000 through starvation from the ongoing blockade, and 100,000 from loss of medical services. In this war, just as in the last, women are at the forefront of the resistance movement. They are leading the fight against the federal government in more ways than one. I'm going to introduce you to a few women, just a few, out of the millions of stories to be told. These women are proudly unremarkable and unexceptional, but they've been affected by this war in remarkable and exceptional ways. These women never intended to fight a war, they never imagined that they would have to, and yet their lives and their futures are now defined by their participation in this conflict. I met these women through an interlocutor here in the UK, who I've been lucky enough to work with for a few years now. I've been in talks with the Tigray diaspora community about research on female fighters in the previous war with the Derg, when this civil war broke out. Ever since, I've been conducting an extensive oral history project to record and preserve women's memories of this war, so they are not left out of the next histories that we tell. I've been doing live history interviews with Tigrayan women in the UK, USA, Sweden, Norway, Australia, Dubai, Kenya, and as many as possible from within Tigray itself, although the communication blackout has made this near impossible. I have met, and I've been honoured to hear, the stories of Tigrayan women who have fled the war, sometimes after being attacked, injured, or arbitrarily arrested. I've heard the stories of survivors of sexual violence, drone attacks, famine, organised massacre. I've also heard the story of women who have been thrust into a world of war so unexpectedly, but have risen to the challenge as community leaders, activists, human rights campaigners, and friends. no Tigrayan life has been left untouched by this war. And this July, I hope to travel to Sudan, where thousands of women are living in refugee camps. By the end of the research, I should have between 60 to 75 testimonies of women in this war, amounting to around 150 hours of interview footage. When the thesis is over and when the dust has settled, I'll be editing these interviews into an open access digital archive, anonymized for participant safety, but available for all to read and listen to the stories of Tigrayan women who have lived and fought this war. Let's meet one of them now. This is Layla, or rather, an artistic representation of Layla to protect her identity. Layla is 24 years old, and she's a soldier in the TDF, the Tigray Defense Force. Before the war, she was a student of engineering at Mekelle University, and now she's in the infantry, working mostly in explosives. When Layla was asked how she was doing as a woman in a predominantly male unit, she said she was having no problems keeping up because she was as fast and as strong as everyone else. She joked that some of her male colleagues were missing the home comforts of their mothers and that she had assumed a responsibility for making sure they were well. We don't know where Layla is right now. She has intermittent communication when she travels outside Tigray, but there are long periods of time where her whereabouts and her condition are entirely unknown. As a historian of gender and conflict, what is so interesting and so telling about Layla's story is the collision between femininity and war. Feminist theorists in history and international relations have shown us that militaries are deeply gendered social institutions. Layla has entered an arena that is built on masculinity, by which I mean a space where strength, risk-taking, endurance, discipline are privileged, and gentleness and domesticity are criticized for their association with the feminine, hence the frequent degradation of enemies in war as being effeminate. Layla has had to reconcile what it means to be a woman in this war, reevaluate her identity in the context of soldiering. We say that defining womanhood is situationally and spatially bound. It is mutable and it is variable. Judith Butler coined the idea that gender requires a doing. It's fundamentally unstable and performative. Just as the previous generation of Tigrayan female fighters disrupted social gender normativity when they joined the TPLF, Layla and her peers are negotiating conceptual categories of gender in this war, specifically of women. They're asking, what does it mean to be a young woman in war today? How does the participation of female fighters become a viable representation of womanhood? Well, in Layla's case, taking on a seemingly maternal role, looking after vulnerable colleagues in the place of their matriarch, is a way of legitimizing female participation in this arena. She's excused from departing her so-called naturally peaceful disposition, and her behavior is endorsed through the narrative of motherhood. She's expressing a sanctioned expression of womanhood, while still operating with the speed and the strength of a good soldier. These dual requirements for Layla reveal a great deal to us about how gender norms are mediated through and by conflict arenas. I also spoke with Layla's sister in the US, who was the one who initially introduced me to her. She said she used to talk to her sister about books and movies, her studies, and their holiday plans. And now she has her phone on loud at all times, even at night and in the shower, in case she misses Layla's call. The conversations are now about if Layla has had enough to eat that day, if she's found anywhere to sleep, and even how hard it is to find a menstrual product in a war zone. Layla said her sister is all grown up now. She's a Tegdalit. She's a fighter woman. She doesn't know if she'll ever get to hold her, hug her, braid her hair ever again. Layla is a familiar version of a participant in war. She's on a battlefield, she wears a uniform, she's armed. But I want to introduce you to the ways in which wars are fought without weapons, by those much less easily identifiable as combatants. I will just add, this is a moment to brace yourself for because it is quite explicit, and do feel free to step out if you need. This is Sofia. Sofia's in Tigray right now, and I made contact with her via a secure VPN at the UN headquarters in Mekelle, which sometimes has intermittent connection. When Ethiopian and Eritrean troops occupied Tigray earlier this year, they systematically raped and abused women, girls, and some men from ages 8 to 80. This included forced incest, deliberate HIV infection, mutilation of a woman's uterus with objects like hot nails and knives to prevent them from having ethnically Tigrayan children. 60% of the survivors interviewed by Amnesty International were raped by multiple perpetrators, or in simpler words, they were victims of gang rape. 20% reported being held for weeks at a time as sex slaves in military camps. We don't know the true number of those affected because of the ongoing blackout, but the UN estimates some 27,000 women will seek treatment for weaponized sexual violence in this war. There will undoubtedly be many more who hide their assault and choose not to report their ordeal. While living under this hostile occupation, while living within the battlefield, Sofia created an underground network of survivors. She has a background as a lecturer in clinical psychology, and she's providing covert support to women, as well as recording and preserving evidence of the crimes that have been perpetrated. She's so far treated over 300 women, all while avoiding detection and arrest by occupying troops. When we spoke, she said to me, "These women need me, so I am here. I don't care what happens to me, I will keep going. Every day could be the day they find me. Until then, I keep going." Sofia is not a soldier. She's never wielded a weapon, except that which she keeps hidden in the form of evidence. She's not even a formal member of any political organisation in Tigray, but she lives on a battlefield. She puts her energy, her actions into working for a military occupier, and she counts her activities as a form of resistance. She plays an active role in the shaping of this war and of how women define their position within it, whether she is an armed combatant or not. In the context of a regime that's seeking to destroy community ties, families, break down the social fabric in their assault on civilians, forming supportive groups, taking part in what we call pro-social behaviours, like Sofia is volunteering her time and expertise to do, is a form of resistance. It's a way of saying you cannot break us. We have too much love for each other. Sexual violence especially tries to create an environment in which it's difficult for survivors and their families to go on as before. But by showing up for the abused, by investing time, money, energy, expertise, Sofia and so many others like her are an integral part of the movement that refuses to be defined on the terms of the oppressor. I have just one more story for you, although I could tell you so many others. Haranet is a leading member of the Tigray Youth Network in the United Kingdom. She lives in London. She's not been to Tigray since the war began. She's an activist, and she's a human rights campaigner, responsible for organising protests, mounting legal challenges to the UK government to ask for interventions and sanctions on Ethiopia, and exploring through the international judicial system possible routes for perpetrator accountability. She's never been on a battlefield. And like Sofia, she's never held a weapon. She is regularly attacked online in digital spaces, some of which pose a credible threat to her person. She's a participant in this war from thousands of miles away. War, for all its flaws, is an arena for change. Haranet is part of the diasporic movement, using the opportunities for conversation and the appetite for revolution brought about in this war to call for long-term transformative gender reform. She is just one of the many women in the Tigray community at the forefront of activism, demanding that this conflict ends with lasting change for gender norms and an end to the permissive environment for gender-based violence upon which perpetrators have capitalised. She wants to create a new Tigray, where survivors of sexual abuse are not stigmatised by shame, and where women are a crucial voice in the peacebuilding process. Haranet is often one of the first privy to evidence of horrific crimes from Tigray, including videos and pictures of massacres and mutilations. She says she cannot, will not stop until there is justice, and that without justice, there can be no peace. She's not a soldier. She does not wear a uniform. She does not even directly engage with her enemy. But she dedicates her time and her energy day in, day out to Tigray and to the broader war effort. And she says, if you ask her in 10 years, did you ever fight in a war? Her answer will be yes. We've now directly met 3 participants whose voices are at the centre of this study, but I'd just like to mention the implicit voices of Tigrayan women in this lecture. It was Athi's voice, a Tigrayan singer and activist who you heard as you entered, singing Tigray Day, which is a resistance love song to the motherland of Tigray. There's also the artist, who I mentioned at the beginning, the phenomenal talent of Gabrielle Tesfaye, who appears throughout the lecture. Her paintings bring this story to life in a way that words never could. Her voice, Athi's voice, Layla's sister's voice, are all part of the tapestry of stories of women in the Tigray War. I spent the past 2 years of my PhD creating a repository of stories like this, an archive of women's voices in this war. I'm asking that we rethink what it means to be a combatant, how we can expand and reevaluate who we deem to be a participant in conflict. I've mentioned Ukraine already, but there's been a lot of discussion in recent news about women who have joined militias and become combatants in Ukraine. And while our hearts stand in solidarity with all of them, this reporting has been highly problematic, not least because it glamorizes and sexualizes Ukrainian women who have made difficult choices in potentially fatal situations. More than this, the reporting on Ukraine has made it seem unusual, revolutionary for women to make that choice and actively participate in armed conflict. This is ahistorical at best. For centuries in Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, women have been integral parts of armed groups and insurgencies. We know the Disney character Mulan, my daughter's favourite, as someone who had to pretend to be a man in order to be a soldier. In reality, she probably would not have had to do so, because there's evidence of female soldiers in China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan and Korea since 500 AD. In 18th century Benin, 3,000 Dahomey women formed a warrior elite we know as Amazons. In Sri Lanka, the Tamil Tigers claimed it was their female members who were the world's fiercest fighters. In Zimbabwe, Angola, Vietnam, Cambodia, women have played integral roles in wars of liberation. We also think there are around 800,000 women in the Soviet Red Army in the Second World War. In France, women were the backbone of the underground resistance movement, carrying messages, acting as spies, providing food and shelter to Allied soldiers at immense personal risk. In Britain, we know women were famously code breakers at Bletchley Park, but what else? By mid-1943, 90% of single women and 80% of married women were involved in the war effort, in factories, on the land or in the armed forces, including my personal favourite, the 165 women who flew Spitfires in the Air Transport Auxiliary. We can acknowledge the specific sacrifices made by Ukrainian women and simultaneously recognise that in every war, in every conflict, women are active, conscious, present participants. We noted at the beginning of this lecture that there is a cycle of invisibilisation of women in conflict, whereby their roles are dimmed or recast in the retelling of that war to allow for familiar gender hierarchies, stability and order in peace. In doing so, we fall into a bit of a trap of hero worship, where we remember and we celebrate exceptional women for their remarkable deeds, but we overlook, we obscure the ordinary masses who are nonetheless valuable, nonetheless present in their engagement in war. It takes a deliberately gendered methodological approach, or in other words, a deliberate awareness of women as the producers and distributors of knowledge, to make sure that these stories are collected and included in the histories that we tell. In Tigray, there will be peace. Not today, but one day. Histories will be written, monuments will be erected, and the story of the Tigray War will be told. We might remember Layla's contributions, although whether or not she chooses to acknowledge her experiences after her demilitarization is another matter. But will we remember Sofia and Haranet and the thousands of others like them who fought beyond the battlefield? Women who have dedicated their energy, experience, time, love, passion to fighting in this war. Will their stories be there when it's time to stand up and be counted? Can we gender historians break the cycle of invisibilization of non-exceptional women who shape and are shaped by war and conflict? That's why researching this history matters. And it's why I love what I get to do here with some of the best support, supervision, guidance in the world. I can only hope that my PhD can even begin to do justice to the much wider project of which it is a part. But the next time you picture, as I asked you to do at the beginning, who fights a war, perhaps you remember these women. And you'll ask yourself, which other wars and times and places in history have contributions like these been overlooked? How often do the women you meet in representations of war been reduced to love interest or mother? Where are the silences, the mistakes and the ways in which women have been remembered for their participation in conflict? I'll just leave you with this thought. Is it any wonder, when we begin to scope the transformative actions of women in war who are so deeply intertwined with the outcome of conflict, that the pronoun frequently ascribed to resistance movements is she? Thank you very much.